I'm a soldier in the United States Army, and I am currently a little half overweight through a deployment in Iraq. About a month ago, they sent a couple guys from my platoon home for various reasons. Gym-related injuries, family tragedies, children being born, etc. So this left us a bit short-handed. I ended up with an extra guard shift at the motor pool, big parking lot with military vehicles, from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. 4 a.m. finally rolls around, our replacements show up, and we're relieved right on time. I grab my weapon and head back to my room. I just passed through the small opening in the T-wall barrier, and it was about 15 meters from the shack I was staying in when something caught my eye on the cement sidewalk in front of me. I stopped dead in my tracks. In front of me, about 30 feet or so, was a black and white cat. I don't know why, but the sight of it caused me to jump, and for some reason, I was just afraid. Not typical like, oh shit kind of fear, but more of a overwhelming anxiety / paranoia. The cat just sat there and didn't move, but looked directly at me. Then I noticed something a little odd. I have a cat back in the States who's the absolute light of my life. A black cat with white paws, a white chest, and a little sliver of white running down the length of his face. This cat looked exactly like mine. Now obviously, I knew that it wasn't. But the sight of a familiar looking feline friend was enough for me to somewhat relax the jumpy feeling I had previously felt. I took about 3 steps forward, slung my rifle to my side, and crouched down with one arm outstretched in an attempt to coax the cat to come over. My lips pursed to make a little noise when I became completely paralyzed with fear. From my eye level standing of about 6 feet to my eye level of crouching of about 3 feet the animal, I was looking completely different, as if my visual perspective completely changed the appearance of the animal. Like one of those optical illusion perspective based art sculptures. What I was looking at no longer looked like a cat, but a large broad dog animal crouched with its head lowered just inches off the ground. All rationality abandoned me at this point. All I could do was stare back at whatever it was. I couldn't make out much of a face. The only light source was from a street lamp about 50 meters behind me past the T-wall. What I was able to make out were its eyes, which I could see clearer than daylight, and they were human. Look into a mirror and open your eyes as wide as you possibly can. That's pretty much what I was looking at. It just stared at me, and I stared back. I will tell you now that I have never been more terrified in my entire life. I slowly stood back up, half expecting whatever I was looking at to take on the appearance of a cat once again, but it didn't. The thing did not move a fucking inch throughout this entire encounter. At this point, my weapon wasn't even enough to make me feel safe. I backed away slowly, all the while keeping my eyes on what was in front of me. I had just about reached the gap in the T-wall again when the thing just disappeared. It didn't back away and vanish into the shadows. It just kind of steadily wasn't there anymore. But right before it vanished, I heard what sounded like a low but somehow loud guttural growling noise that resonated off of the T-wall surrounding the area with the rooms. Needless to say, as soon as I passed back through the T-wall, I fucking bolted. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me with all of my gear onto my team leader's room across the gravel road. I took a moment to calm myself down before entering his room. I slept on his floor that night, blaming it on the fact that we had to get up early and the alarm on my phone hadn't been working lately. I haven't seen anything since, but every other night or so when I'm by myself, I'll get that same horribly overwhelming sense of anxiety / paranoia that I got when I first saw that thing.
This story was told to me by my father, my uncle, and my aunt. They revisited discussing it many times during my life. I think it would be good to share it. During this time, they lived in an apartment in the Midwest. The apartments at that time and in that particular building were built in a long line, one-room entrance, dining area, bathroom, followed by bedrooms. These were referred to as railcar apartments due to the room-to-room connecting design. There was a young couple that lived in the adjoining railcar apartment who had gone out for the afternoon. My curious father and his siblings decided to peek through the windows for fun. The ceilings were high, as were the long, narrow windows. As my nosy relatives looked in the windows, they noticed that the young couple had left the light on in their bedroom. A long, slim black shape was seated at the dressing table as though looking at itself in the mirror. The shape was devoid of features and appeared as a wide piece of clothing with no depth whatsoever. It did, however, seem to have a head and narrow shoulders. They looked in again, and the entity was lying across the bed, with the lower portion draping towards the floor. They became a bit terrified at this point, but my uncle, being the oldest, had my dad and aunt lift him up to stand on the windowsill so that he could see everything. What happened next gives me chills to this day. The long, trailing shape was on the inside and slowly ascended to the height of my uncle's face. It paused there, pitch black and seemingly facing him. He mentioned that it had a sparkly black turban-type affair on its head. He screamed with horror and fell off the window ledge to the ground. Before they all ran away, the entity passed the window slowly as though it were on roller skates and had a distinct profile of a cat or small toddler. It was at this point that the young couple inhabiting the apartment came home. My dad and his siblings tried to warn them of what happened. The couple invited them in, and they went room to room to prove to the kids that nothing was there. What it was, no one knows. I never would have been brave enough to enter the apartment after seeing something like that.
My dad and I would occasionally go hunting together when I was a kid. I was 14, and my dad knew a guy who owned what seemed to be half of Georgia. I mean, the amount of property this guy owned was ridiculous. He let people hunt out there, and if he trusted you, he'd let you camp out there for a couple of nights if you wanted. He'd always make sure we had a way to call for help before we did, though. I loved camping out there more than I did just going hunting for a few hours and then coming home. I liked the woodsman feeling of living out in the woods. We woke up early one morning and hiked into the woods. It was still dark when we got to our stand. We didn't see or hear anything, not even birds. I remember my dad commenting on it, and looking back, it should have been a sign. Frustrated, we back up and look for a spot to camp, and we would set up again later that evening. My dad suggested we go deeper in to better our chances of seeing something, so that's what we did. We hiked for a few hours, found a clearing, set up a small camp, got settled, and passed the time by freaking ourselves out by talking about Bigfoot and other woodland creatures. We hike a ways away from camp, set up our blind, and wait. Again, nothing. We got back and our tent has been pulled up and laid flat. Not in a neat way, but it's kinda laying there. We thought it was just the wind or something, and we didn't put it up right and it collapsed. We didn't think much of it. Since we didn't see or hear anything all day, we decided to leave the following day and try again later that week. We settled in for the night, built a really small fire, and just relax. Again, not even birds are making a sound. I remember thinking how odd it was to be this deep into the woods and only hear 1 or 2 birds the whole trip. Oh well, maybe we are making too much noise and scared everything off. We go to sleep soon after settling in. It's pitch black, middle of the night. I wake up for some reason just to try to go back to sleep. I'm in that half asleep, half awake phase when I hear laughter. I kinda jolt awake, but don't hear it anymore, so I figured it was just a dream. I lay back down, and a few minutes later I hear it again. It continues and gets pretty loud. I wake up again, but this time my dad is up too. He whispers and asks, "Did you hear that?" And this is when my heart dropped. He heard the laughing too. It wasn't a dream. We heard it again, but it was faint, and now that I'm actually awake, I am paying attention to it. It sounded kind of like several people laughing in unison. It wasn't cackling or hysterical laughter, but just kind of normal laughter. It didn't last but for maybe 5 or 6 long motherfucking seconds. I have never felt that much fear before in my life. We didn't hear it anymore after that, but needless to say, we didn't get any sleep. We backed up as soon as the sun came up and got the fuck out. My dad was convinced someone followed us and was playing a prank. That's why we didn't see anything. He said while we were in the stand and blind, they were scaring all of the white light off with their unmasked scent and being on the ground. He says this, but he didn't go back out there for over a month. When he finally did go back, he mentioned it to the guy who owned the property. He wouldn't let my dad hunt there anymore, didn't say why either. My dad thinks he made the guy think that my dad was crazy or something. I guess it is possible for someone to have followed us out there. They must be legit ninjas though, because we went out there before daybreak. Nobody but the owner was parked out there that morning. There were dead leaves and sticks everywhere, and when they decided to laugh, it came from different spots, and I never heard a footstep.
Wildland firefighter with the Forest Service. Not my story, but from an old supervisor of mine that I believe completely. The setting is 2004 or so, Hell's Canyon area of Middle Idaho. His crew had been working all day on an emerging incident and were going to be working throughout the night as well. Being the assistant superintendent of the crew, second in charge effectively, he was out ahead scouting out an ATV or some such. He was working his way down a logging road that clearly had not been used in some time when a bobcat or lynx, it's been a few years since I heard it, appears in the middle of the road but doesn't run away as they usually would. The thing stands there for a good 10 seconds, screams at him, and scampers up a tree not 5 feet off the road. He finds this odd but not particularly unsettling. Just a half mile or so down the road, he finds a small cabin. Also odd, as this is federal land and no private structures should be there. Upon investigation, all the windows had been boarded shut tight, and someone had done a good job of doing so. The doorknob had been punched out and secured to a hole drilled in the log frame by a chain. Someone did not want anything getting in or out. Peering through the hole in the door, he can see that everything in the house is upset. This has him kind of unsettled, so he hops on his ATV and heads back up the road. Well, here's where it gets real interesting. Right where the bobcat had been, there stands a Native American woman in a badly tattered nightgown and bare feet, just standing there. He yells at her, asking if she needs help. She just screamed at him. The same scream as the cat from before, and climbs right up the tree, faster than any human has a right to be climbing. Obviously, he nopes out of there as fast as he can, unaware of who or what he just saw. He asks a local guy about the cabin. After asking around a little, a local Native American hears them talking and informs them that they saw a pumawa. In effect, a skin changer, a warg. Now, I wouldn't believe most people that tried to tell me that, but this was a serious man that did not fuck around about anything. He was dead serious the 2 times I've heard him tell it, and I 100% believe he saw what he saw.
I have many strange stories as I spend a lot of time in the wilderness, often alone, but this one just happened a few weeks ago and was absolutely crazy. I am typing with chills running through my body and goosebumps even thinking about it. I like to camp at a lake in northern Arizona that is rather remote. My favorite spot is on a finger bluff, with cliffs on both sides and a lake, creek, and rich wildlife zones below. This area is home to the most wildlife in Arizona. Elk, deer, bear, wildcat, wild turkey, porcupine, the list goes on and on. A few times at this site, we had hit it off for day hikes, or to go to a lookout point and return to camp to find a pungent stench hanging over the site. I would describe it as a mix between a cow and a horse stable, and horse sweat, like when you take off the saddle on a hot day, with a little bit of skunkiness. I know what elk and bear smell like. I can't explain the smell. This happened multiple times on different trips, and the strange part is that the smell is gone within a minute or two of us returning to camp. Anyway, a few weeks ago, my good friend and I decided to go camping at that spot last minute on a whim. I needed to spread some of my dog's ashes in the area. We started packing up at about 7 p.m. Friday and were just getting into the off-road section by around 2 a.m. It started snowing nearly blizzard conditions once we got off-road. It was so bad that we had to go about 10 miles per hour because the snow was blocking sideway and we could not navigate. It was sticking and getting deeper by the minute. We were going rather deep in and doing some serious 4x4ing. We know we may be stuck at the spot for a few days, but we had what we needed. We arrived at camp at about 3 a.m. and got our tent set up. The snow has stopped now, and we were standing in a winter wonderland lit brightly by the moon. We decided to walk 30 or 40 feet out of camp to the cliff's edge to look at the lake before bed. The lake tapers into a creek and lush wildlife zone about 1,000 feet below us. This is Arizona, so to see the lake in the snow is a real treat that I hadn't experienced before. We are all standing there in complete eerie silence, the kind you only find in the snow, admiring the beauty of nature and talking about how lucky we are to be here while sipping on our beers. We noticed the echo off of the opposite cliff in the silence about half a mile away, so naturally I let out my best rendition of a Bigfoot / war cry. My buddy follows suit. We both get a few out when mid-war cry my friend is cut off by a blood-curdling manimal scream from back behind us on the other side of the camp, maybe 200 feet away. There is an extremely rugged cliff on the side leaning down to a creek / marsh area. I have heard elk as well as wild turkeys call from that area. Now, here is where my hair is standing up as I type. Before we can even process what we just heard, something very large and heavy jumps into the lake / creek directly below us with a loud thump and splash, as if someone did a cannonball, then bobbed back up to the surface. There is a delay, and then something starts kicking and splashing violently, swimming across the river towards us. You could clearly hear the legs kicking like a human. Very powerful. You could hear the concussion in the water with each kick. It sounded like a 500-pound man who is a poor swimmer fully clothed with boots swimming. There was no delay in any of the actions. It was very deliberate, and obviously that it was coming directly towards us. The splashing continues for a few moments. Then we hear it reach our side of the water, and without any delay, you hear the dripping and the river rocks clinking as it gets out of the water and immediately starts smashing through the brush towards us at a constant pace. At this point, we are looking at each other and can't believe what is happening. My friend already had his pistol holstered on his belt, but mine was back at the truck. Breaking limbs soon gave way to the sound of something scrambling over boulders as it's made its way up the hill towards us. We stood there as long as we could until it was obvious it would be closing with us in a minute or less. I was no longer comfortable being there unarmed, so we both bailed back to our camp to get my gun. We stood around for a while longer in complete silence, trying to hear anything, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, and we headed back to bed at about 4 a.m. The rest of the trip was uneventful. What animal at 3 a.m. just after a blizzard with a few inches of snow on the ground jumps completely into freezing water and moves directly towards humans screaming loudly in the night? That is what I want to know. I can't explain it. My only explanation is that maybe if a predator was chasing something that could explain it. But why would run up a nearly vertical 1,000 feet cliff towards shrieking humans? It would be the hardest, slowest route for it to take to escape a predator. That also doesn't explain the other scream or howl we heard, or why this thing sounded completely bipedal. The area is extremely remote, and any human or hoaxer would have been in an immediate survival situation after going into the water.
I apologize for the length of this story, but if it scares anyone a fraction as much as it scared me, it'll be a worthy listen. When I was in my early 20s, I was married with 2 small children. The 4 of us, myself, my husband, my 2-year-old daughter, and our newborn son, were living in an old house that had been converted into apartments. I know that the house was built sometime in the 1920s or 30s, but despite my best efforts, was never able to find out anything more about its history. We moved into the apartment unit on the left side of the ground floor, and we had a young male college student that lived above us. The apartment to the right of us was being renovated, so it was empty at the time. We didn't notice anything weird about the place right away. The first odd thing that I remember happening was that the toilet paper holder in the bathroom had a tendency to turn on its own, faster and faster, until the entire roll of toilet paper had unraveled and was lying in a pile on the bathroom floor. It only ever happened when one of the 2 of us was around to witness it. This was frustrating, but we didn't attribute it to anything paranormal at first. My husband explained it away as a defective toilet paper holder, but when we replaced it with a new one and it continued, he had run out of explanations. Around this same time, my husband and I would be awakened late at night by the sound of children laughing, shrieking, and stomping on the floor of the apartment above us. We thought this was strange, since the college student who lived there didn't have children. We eventually concluded that a girlfriend or relative of his must have moved in, along with her children. After a couple weeks of being awakened by these brats at all hours of the night, my husband resolved to have a conversation with a neighbor about keeping his kids quiet. But when he knocked on his door the next afternoon, nobody answered. Ditto the next day. About a week later, when he finally did spot the neighbor outside getting his mail, my husband approached him. He explained the situation and politely asked the guy if he could maybe put his kids to bed at a reasonable hour because they were keeping us up at night. The guy stares at him like he's crazy. He says he doesn't have any kids. My husband thinks he's just saying it isn't his problem, so he starts to get angry and tell the guy to tell his girlfriend or his sister or whoever's living in the apartment with him to keep their kids quiet. The guy suddenly looks very alarmed. "There's nobody living here but me," he says, "and I haven't even been here for the last month. I just got out of jail on a probation violation." Well, that kind of freaked us out. It must have freaked the neighbor out worse because he packed up and moved a few days later. We stayed, and things got increasingly weird. It seemed like whatever it was thrived on attention and was rather mischievous. Objects began disappearing and reappearing in odd places. This happened so often that eventually it didn't even freak me out anymore. It just annoyed me. When I lost my temper and yelled at whatever it was to give the thing back, it would take longer for it to show up again. I learned that the best way to deal with it was to simply ignore it when it happened, and the thing would eventually reappear, sometimes right where it had vanished. We came to accept that we shared our apartment with at least one entity, but it was childlike and we didn't perceive it as threatening. Over time, another entity started to make itself known. This one was not friendly, and it gave me a very bad feeling. The first time I encountered this being, I was lying on a bed that I shared with my husband with my back to the doorway. My husband and I had been arguing in the kitchen, and he had stormed out of the kitchen and through the back door. I assumed he was going for a drive to blow off steam, so I let him go and stormed off to the bedroom. I was lying on the bed, staring at the wall, when I heard the back door open. I heard footsteps in the kitchen, heading for our bedroom. I assumed it was my husband coming back to tell me he was sorry. The footsteps paused for a moment at the doorway of our bedroom, and then I heard them shuffle across the carpeted floor of our bedroom and over to the bed. Someone sat on the bed next to me. I waited for my husband to speak, but he said nothing. I finally grew irritated with his silence and rolled over to see what his problem was. There was no one there. My husband returned almost an hour later. He had taken that drive after all. The second and last time I encountered this entity, I was, once again, in our bedroom. It was well past midnight. The children were asleep in their beds, and I was settling into mine. My husband wanted to stay up for a while and play video games, so he was in the living room. I had just turned off my bedside lamp and was laying there with my eyes closed, relishing the silence, when I heard footsteps in the kitchen. Once again, the footsteps stopped at the door of my bedroom, which was standing open. "Hey, Tara," I heard my husband whisper from the doorway. I didn't open my eyes. I remember feeling annoyed because I had just been drifting off to sleep. "What?" I snapped. No answer. I opened my eyes. There was a tall, black shape standing in the doorway of my bedroom. It wasn't my husband. It was easily a foot taller, and I couldn't see its face. As soon as I laid eyes on it, the hair on my arm stood up. I knew this thing was bad news. I could feel it. "What do you want?" I managed to say. It didn't say anything. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel it looking at me. It appeared to be growing darker and more solid the longer I looked at it. That moment seemed to stretch out into forever. When I finally could stand it no longer, I shouted, "Go away!" and dove under the covers like a little kid. I don't know how long I huddled under the blankets, but I eventually felt the horrible knot in my stomach loosen, and I somehow knew that it was gone. I sat up, pushed the blankets off me, and looked around. The black shape was gone. I jumped out of bed, strode through the kitchen and into the living room, where my husband was busy playing an old NES game. He took one look at my face and wanted to know what was wrong. "Did you just stand in the doorway of our bedroom and whisper my name?" I demanded. "No," he said. "I've been in here the whole time." That was the last straw. I started looking for a new apartment the next day. We moved out a couple of weeks later. Later on, some friends of ours moved into the same apartment. They too heard the laughing children on the second floor, but fortunately, never encountered the shadowy entity. The thing that freaks me out the most about the whole thing was that it spoke to me in my husband's voice. It sounded so much like him that I didn't question if it was him or not until I opened my eyes. I sometimes wonder, if I hadn't opened my eyes, what would it have said to me? I don't like to think about that.
When I was 18, I lived with my now ex-boyfriend in a basement apartment in a town in Wyoming. It was not a happy time in my life for various reasons. The boyfriend was abusive, I was pregnant with his child, but it also didn't help that the apartment was creepy as shit. Even for a basement apartment, it was unusually dark and cold all the time. As soon as we moved in, weird shit started happening. Scratching noises would seem to be coming from inside the walls. I attributed this to mice, but not a single trap that was set never ever caught one. I would be doing dishes in the kitchen and I would hear an enormous crash from the living room. It would sound so much like the TV had fallen over, taking my boyfriend's shelf of Star Wars memorabilia with it, that I would rush into the living room expecting to find a complete mess and not a thing would be out of place. Sometimes, I would be coming down the dark, narrow hallway that connected the living room to the rest of the apartment, and I would swear that I heard whispering coming from the bathroom at the end of the hall. I would often wake up in the middle of the night after hearing something like a camera stutter clicking right in my ear. As unsettling as these things were, they didn't really disturb or frighten me so much as annoy and puzzle me. When I started finding out the history of the apartment from the locals, and I had some context to put them in, that's when it got scary. A few months after we moved in, a guy from my hometown came to visit me. He was living in the same city at the time, attending the same college that my boyfriend was in. He brought a friend with him who was a local. I greeted the two of them outside of the apartment, and the friend introduced himself and, "This is the apartment that the guy I knew lived in," he said. "Have you had any problems here?" I asked him what he meant, and he told me that the guy he knew who had lived there had been a meth dealer and self-proclaimed Satanist who used to host weird group sex parties in the name of the Dark Lord or some shit. In any other town, this would seem far-fetched, but this town was, or still is, a strange place. The friend said that the guy was now in prison for beating his girlfriend almost to death and pushing a TV over on top of her. Well, that spooked me. I told my boyfriend, who hadn't taken me seriously up to that point, and he, being a non-practicing Catholic, decided that calling a Catholic priest to come over to bless the place was the best solution. I was, or still am, not religious in the slightest, but I didn't have any better ideas, so we called the local parish and they sent an old priest over. He sprinkled some holy water around, said a few prayers in Latin, and was gone. Later that night, we were invited into a small gathering at the neighbor's apartment. He lived in the apartment directly above us, and we had told him earlier in the day about the priest coming over to bless the place because of the spooky shit that was going on. When we arrived at his apartment that evening, he asked us how it went, and we shrugged and said it was fine. "Then why were you screaming?" he asked me. "Were you having devils cast out or something?" My boyfriend and I exchanged puzzled looks. I told him I hadn't been screaming, nobody had. The whole thing had been pretty uneventful. The neighbor swore up and down that he heard a woman screaming coming from the apartment while the priest was in there. He had thought it was me being exorcised or something. What in the fuck? I had hoped that was the end of it, but it wasn't. Things actually started to get worse over the next few months. The weird noises came more frequently. The camera shutter sound woke me up every night instead of just once in a while. My boyfriend began experiencing the phenomena as well. Around this time, the fights we were having started to escalate and my boyfriend became very violent. He had never been a nice guy exactly, but I had never thought he would actually hit me with closed fists. But he did, and quite often. It was a very bad time. Early one morning, I woke up suddenly and saw that my boyfriend was still asleep in the bed next to me. I looked away to check the clock, and when I looked back, He was staring at the ceiling with his eyes wide open. It startled me because I had never seen him wake up so suddenly. I said good morning and asked if he was okay. I spoke to it. He said, "The thing that lives here. It told me I can't leave. It said it owns me now." I started to ask him what the hell he was talking about, but he immediately closed his eyes and went back to sleep. Somewhere deep down, I thought I knew what he was talking about, and that freaked me out even more. One night, a few weeks later, I was alone in the apartment. My boyfriend was out drinking with his friends. I was watching Ace Ventura, Pet Detective on TV in the living room. I decided to go to the kitchen to get a drink. As I was walking down the long dark hallway to the kitchen, I stopped dead in my tracks. I had heard something growl. At first, I thought it must have been the TV, but as I strained to hear, the noise coming from the TV in the living room was Jim Carrey doing one of his voices. The growl came again, and it was coming from somewhere much closer and off to my right. I turned and saw a dark shape crouching in the hallway. I had just enough time to wonder if a stray dog had somehow gotten in when the thing stood up and rushed at me, snarling. I fucking freaked, bolted down the hallway, up the stairs, and out the front door. The neighbor who lived above us wasn't home, so I went up another flight of stairs and knocked on a different neighbor's door. The lady named Dawn, who lived in the apartment on the top floor, came to the door. I had not met her before this, but I immediately started babbling about the shadow thing in my apartment and begged her to come take a look. She and her SO, who lived there with her, accompanied me downstairs. There was nothing to see and nothing out of place, but the hallway was ice cold. I felt stupid and crazy and embarrassed, but Dawn told me she believed me. "You know, this apartment is messed up," she said. "Lots of crazy shit has gone down here." I told her that I had already heard about the Satanist dude who tried to murder his girlfriend. She laughed and said that was not the only guy who had lived there. Before that guy, a Mexican lady had lived there. She was a devout Catholic who did not speak a lot of English and had a life-size crucifix on a wall. Dawn had never seen anything like it outside of a church, and when she asked about it, the Mexican lady crossed herself and said that this was to keep the evil in the apartment at bay. Before that lady, the apartment had been rented by a photographer who used it as his darkroom. He was busted for kiddie porn. My blood froze as I remembered the weird camera shutter noises that would wake me up. Dawn told me more about the history of the apartment and the people who had lived there, but I can't recall any of the other details. Just that each person had either been terrified of the place, been a terrible person, or met a terrible end. I moved out of that apartment and back in with my parents a few weeks later. I might have stayed longer if not for the fact that my boyfriend had become so violent during one of our fights that he threatened to kill me and then himself. Whether it was him finally showing his true colors or the evil in the apartment working on him, I'll probably never know. But I knew that my life and the life of my unborn child was in danger, so I got the fuck out of there and out of the relationship. The unborn child I mentioned is 12 now. Abusive boyfriend is out of the picture and has been for over a decade. I am still very good friends with Dawn. Sometimes I still have dreams about that place though. The dreams are always terrifying, and sometimes I wake up in the dark, totally convinced for a few moments that I am back in that apartment.
Here's a story that I've not shared before because, honestly, it creeps me the fuck out. I don't like thinking about it. I don't like the things it implies about the nature of the universe we inhabit. and it fills me with existential dread. It also happens to involve a friend's suicide, so it's not the easiest thing in the world to talk about, even without the paranormal stuff. About 7 years ago, my friend Dave blew his brains out with a shotgun. Tragic though it wasn't much of a shock for those of us who knew him. The dude had always had some serious issues with depression, and he'd threatened to end his life before, many times. Add to this the fact that he was recently separated from his wife and had moved back in with his brother and was using meth again. And yeah, the writing was pretty much on the wall. About 3 weeks after his death, his widow, Jessica, who happens to be my best friend, came to see me. She was clearly upset. She shoves her cell phone into my hand and tells me that I need to hear this voicemail. She doesn't tell me anything else about it, so I listen to it. It was static, but underneath the static, there was a voice. It sounded like it was coming from far away and across a very bad connection. It was Dave's voice. I would have recognized his gruff baritone anywhere. And he was shouting my friend's name over and over again. Jessica. Hey, Jessica. Hey, Jessica. Hearing his voice, knowing that he was almost a month in the ground, and the fact that he sounded so desperate and afraid made my blood run cold. I handed the phone back to Jessica and just kind of stared at her stupidly for a moment. That was Dave, I finally said, when I could speak. I know, she said. The voicemail had apparently just shown up in her voicemail inbox, with no record of a missed call and no phone number attached to it. We both listened to it again 3 or 4 times, just to be sure, but when Jessica went to show someone else a few days later, she was surprised to discover that it had spontaneously deleted itself. It was just gone. About a week or so after that, my ex-husband, Ivan, stopped by to drop off our son for a shared custody arrangement. He'd been Dave's best friend since childhood, so even though things were kind of tense between the two of us, I wanted to let him know how sorry I was and that he shouldn't blame himself for not being there. We talked about Dave for a few minutes, and I mentioned the strange voicemail that Jessica had gotten. Far from being shocked like I thought he would be, he simply nodded knowingly. I got one too, he said. Same thing. Static. But his voice underneath that. Only he was screaming my name instead of Jessica's, and my phone actually showed that the voicemail and a few other missed calls came from Dave's cell phone. I never heard the phone ring though, and this was all weeks after he died. I was pretty disturbed by this, so I began casting about for explanations. Was it possible that Dave's phone was still functioning? Maybe his brother was carrying it around in his back pocket and butt dialing it? Maybe the family hadn't turned it off yet. Ivan rejected each proposed explanation, since he had already investigated. Apparently, Dave's family had terminated his phone service within a couple of days of his death. It should have been impossible for that phone to make any calls. And while butt dialing might explain how a dead person's phone could make calls weeks after the owner's death, well, it doesn't really explain those voicemails. I asked Ivan if I could listen to the voicemail on his phone, but he shook his head. It's gone, he said. It just disappeared after a few days. So did the record of the missed calls from Dave's number. I went to show them to somebody, and they suddenly weren't there. It's been many years, but thinking about that voicemail still makes me break out in goosebumps. It was frightening to me for many reasons. For one thing, I don't like thinking that my friend Dave, who was so tormented in life, would continue to be so in death. I don't like how he sounded in that voicemail. He sounded terrified. I struggle with depression myself, and there have been times in the years since when I found myself staring over a literal or proverbial edge, contemplating ending it all. But always, the memory of that voicemail and of Dave's voice will come to me, and I talk myself down. Because wherever Dave was calling from, I don't want to end up there.
Backstory. The U.S. Army bought the town of Overhills, North Carolina for Fort Bragg soldiers to train on. It consists of a post office, a stable, a barn, a two-story garage, a golf course, several houses, and a large mansion that was once owned by one of the Rockefellers. Me and a group of friends decided to go out to explore the area. There were 7 of us. Myself, my wife's friend, my wife's cousin, and 3 friends from the army. We had been out there before, but the girls hadn't, so we figured it would be a fun trip. First stop is the post office and the stables and the barn that are about 50 yards down the road. Nothing crazy happened here, but it was starting to get dark, so it kind of set the mood. We get to the first of the houses and my buddies decide to go take a look around. I looked at the first floor and it was pretty basic. My friends decided to try and go into the basement. To say the stairs were shitty was an understatement. During process, one of my friends, Jay, started feeling like he was getting choked. He actually had to leave because he felt really uneasy about it all. I think he had a reaction to dust and was scared. He was always a little dramatic. We then moved on to the mansion. It was 3 stories with a large porch on the second floor, which has since collapsed. We were in 2 SUVs. I was driving the one with all the girls in it, and my buddies were in the other. I usually doubt paranormal things and try to take steps making sure something we think is spooky is really just someone being dumb. We all get out of the car and I made sure everyone closed their doors and I locked the car. I had already been in the house a few times, so I stayed outside to look around. My wife and her friend went to look around outside of the house, and her cousin and my friends went inside. A short time later, my wife and friend came running out from behind the house, swearing they heard little girls playing and yelling. I walked over there, but I couldn't hear or see anything, so I dismissed it. I keep looking around to see if I can catch one of those split-second sightings. I happened to look over the Jeep, and the dome light was on. I was a little spooked, but I walked over and made sure all of the doors were locked, and they were sure enough the dome light was on. Right about that time, I hear a loud crash that honestly sounded like a safe or heavy box hitting the floor. All 4 of my friends in the house screamed and ran out of the house towards us. They explained that one of them went to go into one of the bathrooms on the 3rd floor and the door had slammed in his face. When I say though that it had been kind of the heaviest and hardest door slam in history, I am not exaggerating. By that point we were all freaked out and ready to go. So as we were leaving, my wife looks back at the house. She didn't tell me this part until we got home, but she saw a young black man standing there looking at us in tattered khakis and a dirty white shirt as we drove away. My only thought that was in my mind was that he was playing tricks on her. Years later, I asked my friend if he was messing with us with the door, and he swears to this day he didn't.
At the time, I was recently out of the Army and started working for the DoD. My ex and our kids had just moved into a home we rented right outside the outskirts of Leesburg, Virginia. Nothing out of the ordinary. Quiet neighborhood at the end of a cul-de-sac and off a road that connects the town with a main highway to Washington, D.C., down south, and a rural road that runs all the way out to West Virginia and Appalachia. This was the summer of 2009. And at the time, I had only 2 dogs and not 3 as I do now. At the time before our furniture arrived from my last duty station, we basically had to live with a few items and sheets in an unfurnished home in the basement. Now, the home was a 70s type tri-story home, single level in the front yard, and a 2-story with the basement walkout in the backyard. The thing literally looked like it was from the '70s show, between the thick shag carpet and solid wooden panel walls in the basement. Now, I'm usually the type of guy who goes off his gut feeling and instinct, and the first thing I noticed on my first night there with my ex and kids was, as we slept in the basement, it just felt off. It literally felt like somebody was watching us sleep. I chalked this up to being a new home, an unfamiliar location, plus exhaustion. So I fell asleep with no issues and forgot about it over the next few days. Once my household goods arrived, we settled in. Things seemed to be normal for a few weeks. Then, in the midsummer, things started happening. Slowly at first. My ex would complain that in the evening or night, wherever she went downstairs to grab items or do laundry in the basement, she could feel something standing behind her and watching her. She became so unnerved that she would block the small window looking out into the yard at night, because she told me, "I feel like someone is watching me in our yard." Now, granted, my yard is not huge, but it's about an acre to square foot acre in size and has a steep drop-off near the back towards the neighbor's yard and the adjacent golf course. At around this time, a good friend of mine with his wife needed a new place to stay since their home they were renting was going on the market to be sold by their landlord, so they stayed with us for a few months until they found a new place. At this time, I did a lot of traveling and would be gone for several days at a time from my home. And mind you, my army buddy is the same one that deployed with me 3 times to Iraq. This guy is most definitely the last person to be shaken, let alone intimidated by anything. When he moved in, things definitely went up a notch. The first really creepy recurring thing began when our front door would become unlocked whenever we came home after grocery shopping, a quick trip to the gas station, or just for a walk down the street. At first I blamed my ex for not locking it, then after a second time I watched her lock it. A third time, I locked the door myself. By the 4th time, I decided to grab my concealed carry sidearm, and when I came home and the door was unlocked, I asked my wife and kids to stay in the driveway as I cleared my home. My biggest fear was that someone was watching us to rob us or just messing with us, so you can imagine it was unsettling and felt surreal calling out to a non-existent person in the home as I meticulously cleared it out with my handgun. After checking everything, I called an all clear and we all came inside the house. We didn't decide to tell our young kids to not scare them at first since we weren't sure what was going on. When we were discussing it at dinner with our friends who were living with us, my friend, I'll call him Tom, told us that Tom went out to get some gas for his truck while my ex and I were away with the kids for that weekend. Tom came back 5 minutes later and saw that the door was just slightly propped open and unlocked. So fearing just as I did for a break-in, he grabbed his sidearm and searched the house and didn't find anything. Second time Tom and his wife went out to dinner. Come back 2 hours later. Same deal. Door slightly ajar and unlocked. Now, Tom is a guy who is almost borderline OCD when it comes to little details, so I know for a fact he locked the door and so did his wife. The more unsettling events started happening when I was gone for about a month. Right before I left, my ex and I went out to dinner and left the kids at home with Tom and his wife. We had a pretty good time and decided to turn in for the evening prior to my long trip. When we came home, Tom was actually waiting up for us with his wife. Tom told us that after dinner, the kids went to bed. Tom and his wife were in the next adjacent bedroom when, after about 25 minutes, they heard knocking on the wall. So Tom's wife called out to the kids to cut it out and go back to sleep, and the knocking stopped. A few minutes later, again, tap, tap, tap. This time Tom calls out to them to stop again. Once again, the knocking stops. A minute goes by, this time yet again, but louder and more forceful. Tap, tap, tap. So Tom gets up and opens the door, walks down the hallway to the next bedroom and swings open the door. Kids are all asleep, away from the wall and racked out. As he's standing there again, tap, tap, tap. So Tom grabs his handgun and clears the house, thinking someone's inside. He tried to dissuade him, but he did it anyways. Not having found anything, no more knocking happened that night. A few weeks later, I'd come back from a road trip, At that point in time, Tom and his wife moved out into their own place. The door, wall tapping and knocking, stopped to an extent, and so did the front door randomly unlocking itself. By this time, it was early fall, and at that point in time, I would decompress by playing on my PC, which sits in my living room later on in the evening. Now, I wear headphones when I play just because I use VoIP and TeamSpeak when I do. This evening, I was just jamming out to some Pandora. Everyone was in bed, so I started playing my games. I guess what happened next is best described as if you're doing something and you begin to hear a side conversation, almost like a murmur, like people talking in whispers and hushed tones at the library. The kicker is, of course, I'm in a game session with music going plus headphones, but I was not mistaken. I could hear a conversation going on, just barely audible and unintelligible at the same time. I slowly took my headphones off and shut the PC off. Absolute silence. So I turn it back on and go back to gaming. Again, I start hearing a conversation. So this time I think, okay, long-corded headphones. Maybe I'm picking up an FM or AM station. So I switch out to cordless USB ones. Same thing happens again. Finally, I unplug my headphones, shut down everything, then put my headphones on. Silence. And then after a minute, once again, a very, very quiet murmur and talking. It was unnerving because I couldn't tell if I was imagining hearing things or if it was real. To say the least, I did not want to put my headphones back on and hear the murmur again that evening. Next morning, I asked my ex if she's heard anything while I was gone for a few weeks. She told me she could hear just at the edge of her hearing a man and a woman softly talking. Couldn't make out the words, but could tell it was a man and a woman. Didn't seem upset or angry, just very, very soft talking. If you tried to listen in on it, it would go away most of the time. So finally, I decided to look up any history on the area and our home. What limited info I could find was that the town I lived in was very old. Originally, the area was inhabited by Native American tribes, particularly the Siouan tribes, until the area became Leesburg around the 1730 to 40s timeframe. But interestingly enough, when I typed in ghosts in Leesburg, it turns out that the town is quite haunted according to the locals, and there are a lot of haunted tours as well. No info on the house itself, though. Finally, things started picking up during mid-fall. At that time, I decided to get another dog, and after picking him up from the local pet store, we brought him home to wander around and explore the property and to meet the other dogs. Now, it's one thing when you or another person feels or experiences something, but it's downright creepy when your pets see and or sense something that you cannot, and they know it's there. So a few days in, I noticed all three of my dogs never went into the basement. Even if a toy dropped down the stairs, they wouldn't go down there. So I decided to head downstairs and bribe my dog with a treat to get him to come down. Nothing. Nada. Dog just sat there looking at me from the stairs. Calling over didn't work. Hell, even a strip of bacon didn't work. So I decided, screw it, grabbed the dog and carried it downstairs. Let me tell you, it was a big German Shepherd dog, and let me tell you something else. I've never heard an animal whine so much with anxiety and fear in my life. As soon as I sat him down, the dog bolted, and I use capital letters. It literally bolted up the stairs. My two other dogs refused to come down either. This is in broad daylight with everyone home, mind you. I didn't tell it to my ex or the kids. I didn't want to spook them unnecessarily. Another time, my boxer was staring off into the hallway when my ex and my kids were out of town visiting her relatives as I stayed home. I just finished cooking dinner for myself when I sat down on the couch with my food on my plate. As I sat down, I heard a distinct noise that could be best described as someone smacking their lips and sniffing really loudly. I instinctively called out to my boxer to cut it out. Then I realized my dog was still outside in our backyard with the others. So I went out back and got them, and as I came in, my boxer stopped at the hallway and just stared. I looked where she was, and I couldn't see anything, but I've never even seen a dog, let alone mine, stare like that. Just staring, unmoving, and not even blinking. I had to call her name twice to make her snap out of it, whatever it was. It was creepy because of the way she just ever so slightly cocked her head to the side and stared at something I couldn't see. She wasn't upset or growling, just staring very intently. A few days later, I would say the most personal and unnerving experience happened. It was quite late on a Saturday night. My ex and I were having a few cigarettes and some whiskey out in the three-season porch overlooking the backyard. It was late. We had a few drinks in us. Kids were in bed. We were having a good time. I asked her if she wanted anything from the kitchen before I went and got a refill, and she said no. Now, our kitchen and dining room are right next to each other, and our dining room leads out into the porch and backyard. The only thing separating them is a screen and glass door. The glass door was open, but the screen was shut so we could hear the kids inside if need be. So, I stood up, walked through the dining room, took a right into my kitchen. Standing there, I start pouring myself some Jack Daniels and a Coke. Then I hear the pitter-patter of feet on the wooden floor. Kind of the same sound that a small barefoot child would make if they were walking or running. Thinking to myself it's one of my kids being out of bed, I casually call out to them. "Michael, go back to bed. Mom will be upset if she sees you out here. You know better than that." At the time, my son was 6 years old, hence me thinking it was him and the sound of his feet. I paused for a moment, didn't hear anything, and continued pouring my drink. Again, I hear the pitter-patter of little feet on the floor, so I mutter under my breath and call out, "Michael, you better be in bed by the time I walk out there." So I finish pouring my drink to give my son enough time to scoot to bed. I slowly walk out of the kitchen and into the dining room, and then take a left out into the hallway connecting all the bedrooms. Absolute silence. I make my way to the end of the hallway and open my kid's bedroom door. All of them are passed out on the ground in a tangle of blankets and toys. I bend down gently and try to reposition my son to see if he's fake sleeping or if he darted into the bedroom before I stepped out into the hallway. Right as I'm down with him at face level, I hear footsteps immediately behind me in the hallway, slowly receding. It happened so suddenly that I didn't turn my back to see what was there. I literally froze in disbelief. The steps walked away from me, towards the end of the hallway where the basement entrance is. What happened next made my skin crawl. The steps stopped, and I heard the distinct click and pull of my basement door handle opening. The door and handle itself were quite old, so it always made a rusty, grinding noise whenever you pushed down on the door handle to open the door, followed by the slow and steady and very unmistakable noise of my basement door creaking open, and then followed by much larger, adult-like steps descending down the basement stairs very slowly, almost casually, finally followed by the door ever so slowly closing, and the sound of the door handle being pushed down gently so it can click the door shut. Least to say, I flew into my porch where my ex-wife stammered out, "Did you just hear that?" Her look made me realize how startled I'd looked to her. She told me she didn't, and at that point I said, "Fuck it, I'm done with these games." I marched downstairs and turned the lights on and called out, "Whoever you are or whatever you are, I don't care. This is my home. I live here. You don't, dead or alive. This is my family and my place, and there's no room for you or whatever it is you are. Now please, leave." My ex stood next to me looking at me like I was insane. Well, lo and behold, from that day until we moved out 4 months later due to a new job, absolutely nothing else happened. I tried setting up a tape recorder and a digital voice recorder downstairs for several days with nothing on it. Whatever it was, left as soon as I had had enough and confronted it. For me, it was a happy ending. Whatever it was didn't seem malicious, more like it just enjoyed messing with us. Ironically, our children only heard the knocks once we talked about it a few years later. It was only myself and my ex that would hear other things going on. Ever since, I have not had any experiences at all whatsoever. In fact, I don't have any experiences prior leading up to these events either. All I can say is I went from a skeptic to a believer. Not right away, of course, but that last event definitely made me one. To this day, I can still remember the door creaking open slowly and deliberately, and those enunciated, loud adult steps going down the basement stairs.
This is an absolutely true experience, and from what I can figure, it doesn't involve the supernatural or paranormal, yet still it fits here. I have a friend, we'll call him Andy, and he has anxiety issues. He was, and still is, in a long-distance relationship a few years back, and his girlfriend was flying in from near Seattle all the way down to Lafayette, Louisiana. He was unfamiliar with the airport's terminal location, so he asked me to show him the easiest way to get there. Unfamiliar routes always increase his anxiety levels, so I gladly obliged. He picked me up later that night, and we headed towards the airport. We always tend to hang out by riding around town and shooting the shit, and it was Saturday, so we were planning on doing just that after our excursion to the airport anyway. It was probably around 11 p.m. at this point. I show him the most efficient routes. As we were getting ready to turn into the main road back, he makes an accidental left instead of right. I thought he did this intentionally at first, so I didn't say anything, but he soon voiced his concern about where we headed. He had passed all the major roads on our right accidentally, and there were no turnarounds on our left or intersections up ahead. Only the next little town, which was a couple of miles ahead. I suggested we just exit there and turn around. He was doing alright at this point, but his nerves were just starting to show. We exit into the town or city and keep looking for a place to turn around. We come up to and go through a roundabout. Somehow we both didn't take note of what direction we were headed now. We made our way deeper into the town and he pulled into and turned around in a parking lot. We headed back in what we thought was the way we came, but soon realized that we were lost. Both he and I had never been there, so we didn't know how to get back. He handed me his phone as I still only had a flip phone and told me to pull up the GPS. I opened the app, but it wouldn't work for whatever reason. He pulled over and tried again. It still wouldn't give us our location. He tried everything else he could think of, but still no dice. This wasn't too unexpected, as he had been having issues with the phone lately. So now we took stock of our situation and tried to form a plan. We drove around looking for an open business or gas station to ask for directions, but had no luck whatsoever. The only thing we could think to do was attempt to keep tracing our path and look for landmarks, but it was dark, so it wasn't helping. We drove down all sorts of winding roads, occasionally finding ourselves near something we saw earlier, but that didn't lead us back to the highway. We were going down one particular road that led sort of out in the country. Neither of us were scared or agitated at our present situation by this point, and he had actually started to laugh at how ridiculous it was becoming. We were lost in 2014, and technology couldn't help us. After getting back seemingly closer to town, we pulled onto another random road. We were coming up to a left curve in the road where we passed in front of a white house on the right side of the curve. There was a gravel parking lot along the front of its front short wooden fence, but no business sign or anything of that kind. There were 8 to 10 vehicles parked in the lot, all facing the roads with their dim lights on, but no one in them or in the yard. No one could be seen moving inside of the house either, yet all of the lights seemed to be on. The house was an older looking 2-story one, with strange tall barred windows along the front bottom floor. This was at about 12:30. When I first looked over the house, I got this instant rush of dread and fear. It's hard to describe, but it was similar to the kind you get when you get into a fight or flight mode. There was a green SUV in front of us at the time, and they pulled into the left park of the parking lot in front of us. Andy continued on around the curve in silence. As soon as we rounded the curve, he looked at me briefly and in a scared voice he said, "What the fuck was that?" I was still inexplicably shaken and replied, "What?" "The house," he replied. "There's something wrong about that house." It took me a moment to process this, and I told him about the instant feeling of fear I had in myself. He said when we were passing it, he looked over at it and felt the exact same thing. We couldn't for the life of us explain it. The house just felt oppressive and wrong, as if something really fucking bad was happening inside as we passed. It instantly killed our jovial mood. To make a long story short, Andy's girlfriend happened to call him not too long after this to finalize the travel details. He told her what happened with me chiming in here or there over the speakerphone. She could tell we were shaken up and offered to guide us out. We gave her an intersection street sign and she looked at it and gave us directions back. We luckily didn't pass back in front of that house. After Andy finished the call, we discussed the experience all the way back to my house, but between the two of us couldn't come up with a plausible explanation. I have never experienced anything similar to this date, and I am very skeptical and rational, yet I had and have no rational explanation for this. Over the last 2 years, I have tried to locate the house using Google Maps and identify it, but I just can't find it. I just want to find it and look it up.
This is one of the strangest stories I've ever heard, and I still don't know what to make of it. It happened to my brother, who is a definite skeptic and not prone to making up stories. It was also partially confirmed by my dad. My brother was 11 or 12 at the time this story takes place. My family lived in a big farmhouse on a dirt road about 20 miles or so from the nearest town. It was so isolated that the closest neighbor was about 5 miles away. My brother's room was on the second story, and it had a single window set high in the wall. It was late at night and everyone else in the house was asleep. My brother was awake working on his model train set. He's kind of a weirdo like that, with his back to the window. My brother is fully engrossed in painting the little numbers on a model train when he hears something knocking on his window. Now, there are no trees that close to the house, so it can't possibly be the wind causing branches to scrape against the window. And it isn't that kind of sound anyway. It's the distinct sound of knuckles rapping on glass. My brother freezes and listens for a second, then decides he must have imagined it. He tries to shake off the creepy feeling and goes back to doing what he's doing, but a few seconds later, it happens again. Knock, knock, knock. My brother, who should have been a cop or a Marine because nothing really scares him, told me that he was terrified to turn around at that moment because he was afraid of what he would see. But he does, very slowly, and looks up at the window. The thing knocking on the window has its face pressed up against the glass and is staring at him with beady black eyes. He described it as a sort of human-ape hybrid thing with long, scraggly orange fur like an orangutan. Its facial features are disturbingly humanoid, though, and he knows that he should not be seeing whatever it is he's seeing. It is impossible. As he stares up at it in disbelief and horror, it grins at him menacingly, displaying rows of sharp, pointy yellow teeth. My brother runs screaming from his room and down the hall, where he wakes up my parents. My dad listens to him long enough to discern that there's someone, or something, outside my brother's second-story window, which can only mean that someone has climbed up the side of the roof and onto the house. Dad grabs his shotgun and books it into my brother's room, but the thing's already gone. My dad then runs down the stairs and outside and circles the house a few times, looking up at the roof. Nothing. He comes back inside and tells my brother he must have dreamt it and to go back to bed, but he looks kind of shaken. Years later, my dad admits that while he never saw the thing himself, he did see two huge handprints on the other side of the glass. It disturbed him enough that he climbed up onto the roof the next day and washed all the windows. That's not the end of the story, however. It has a strange epilogue. A few months later, my family takes a trip to Michigan to visit relatives. My brother was excited to see our cousin Jacques, who's the same age as him. After reuniting and chatting excitedly about girls and arcade games for a while, my brother decides to tell Jacques about his weird experience with the ape man knocking on his window. When he's finished telling the story, he expects Jacques to make fun of him, but Jacques doesn't. Jacques' face has gone completely white and he looks absolutely terrified. My brother asks him what's wrong. The exact same thing happened to me, Jacques tells him, only after it knocked on my window, it spoke to me. It asked me where the door was. Possible explanations. A. Jacques is full of shit. I could easily believe that since he's a bit of a joker, but my brother isn't. And anyhow, that wouldn't explain the handprints that my dad saw. My dad is most assuredly not full of shit. Someone, or something, was definitely outside my brother's window that night. B. Some psycho dude in a monkey suit with killer latex makeup skills who enjoyed pranking people in isolated farmhouses was making the rounds. This theory doesn't sound all that plausible to me, and it's no less creepy. Or C. Some strange entity was stalking two people in my family over a distance of 1,000+ miles. I'd be interested to hear if anyone else has had a similar experience or a different explanation that I haven't thought of.
This just happened to a good friend of mine a few days ago. The friend's name is Sammy, and she's one of the most skeptical people that I know. So when she tells me something truly weird happened to her, I believe her. Sammy works for a medical supply company whose offices are located in an old building that once housed a private dental practice. Across the hall from Sammy's office is a staircase that leads down into a small room that is used for storage. Sammy was working there one afternoon a few days ago when the power went out during a thunderstorm. It was the middle of the day and Sammy's office has large windows that let in plenty of natural light, so she kept working through the power outage. Then she remembered that she had to take several boxes of medical supplies downstairs to the storage room, which was dark and had no windows. The storage room is known to all of the employees as a rather creepy place that is always just cold, but Sammy wasn't concerned about this. She was more worried about tripping and falling down the stairs in the dark and twisting an ankle. Eventually, she decides that she had been down those stairs hundreds of times with the lights on, so she could probably do it without it. She grabbed the medical supplies and started to head downstairs. She was about halfway down when she suddenly realized that there was something at the bottom of the stairs. A dark shape that was blacker than the blackness around it. She stopped dead in her tracks and had just enough time to wonder who the fuck was down there when the shape suddenly rushed at her. She stumbled and dropped the boxes she was carrying, cringing away from the thing, but it passed right through her. She said it felt cold and made her feel lightheaded and slightly dizzy. It also smelled strongly of rubber, but slightly sweet, like the mask the dentist puts over your nose and mouth when they administer gas. When it had gone, Sammy took a moment to clear her head, then bolted back upstairs into her office, shutting the door and locking it behind her. The kicker? Back in 1974, the dentist who owned and worked out of that particular office building was found dead. Apparently, he had been getting high every night after he closed up shop and had fallen asleep with the gas mask on, asphyxiating himself. I guess he's still in there.
I really don't know how to classify this story, as I was present but did not see the thing myself. I wanted to share it with my truthers because I think it shows an interesting facet to paranormal phenomena. When I was 17, I lived with my parents and sister in a subdivision about 8 miles from the nearest town. There were other houses around, and they were kind of spread out. My best friend at the time, Elise, lived in the house just over the hill. This was pretty convenient because whenever we wanted to hang out, we could just hike this little dirt trail about a half-mile long over to the other one's house. It was super easy to sneak out at night and meet up too. One night, Elise was staying the night at my house. We had planned to stay up late painting our toenails and doing girly stuff, but when Elise opened her overnight bag, she discovered that she'd forgotten her enormous collection of nail polishes. It was obviously so important that we had them, so we decided to sneak out, it was about midnight or 1 a.m., and walk up the hill to her house to retrieve them. There was an almost full moon in the sky, so the path up the hill was pretty well lit. We were glad of this because we didn't want to take flashlights. Some of the neighbors around there were really uptight and would have called the cops in a heartbeat for something as minor as 2 people with flashlights wandering around outside. It was also a trail that both of us had walked hundreds of times, so we knew it well and were comfortable walking on it, even in the dark. So we're walking up the trail. I think we were about at the halfway mark between our 2 houses, and we're whispering and giggling the way teenage girls do. I'm looking up at the stars, which are breathtakingly gorgeous out in the country with no light pollution, when Elise stops dead in her tracks and digs her nails into my arm. She says, not in a whisper, "What is that?" I look over at Elise and she's staring at the path straight ahead of us. I follow her gaze, but I don't see anything. I ask her what she's talking about, and without ever taking her eyes off whatever she's seeing, she points at the ground in front of us, about 4 or 5 feet away. "That thing," she says, and I look again, but I still have no idea what she's looking at. I open my mouth to tell her so when she suddenly lets out the most god-awful shriek and digs her nails even deeper into my arm. She takes off running in the direction we came from, dragging me down the hill behind her. She moved so fast and was dragging me so forcefully that my feet barely touched the ground all the way down the hill. We finally get back to my house, and she drags me inside the front door and slams it shut behind us. I'm a little pissed, because I'm sure my parents are awake now and will be coming down the stairs any minute to ask us what in God's name we think we're doing outside at this hour. But when I see how terrified she is, I forget all about that. She's crying and hyperventilating and is so upset that I have to make her some tea before she'll calm down. Somehow my parents didn't wake up through all of this. When she was finally calmed down enough to talk about it, I asked her what she saw. She said that she saw a ball of glowing orange light floating in the middle of the path ahead of us. It had hung there in midair for a few moments, pulsating, and then suddenly swelled in size and rushed at us. That was why she'd screamed and dragged me down the hill. Throughout the ordeal, I never saw or heard a damn thing, but I never doubted Elisa's story then, and I don't now. I believe she saw what she saw, even if I wasn't able to prove it. I had marks on my arm from her fingernails sticking into me to prove how scared she was. I know this story isn't as creepy as some here, but I wanted to share it because I think it reveals something sort of interesting about supernatural phenomena. I find it baffling and fascinating that I wasn't able to see whatever it was, but Elise did. I don't know if it was because she has some sort of ESP that I do not, or maybe I was standing at the wrong angle, or maybe she had some higher concentration of some sort of mineral or hormone that made her able to see it. I don't really know. I only have half-baked theories. As for the ball of orange light, I've heard stories of encounters with similar phenomena since. I'd be interested to hear from anyone else who's seen a familiar thing or had a similar encounter, or some idea as to what my friend saw that night.
This happened several years ago, during my freshman year of college. I was riding my bike to school through the old part of town, creatively nicknamed Old Town, on a street that runs behind several businesses. These businesses are housed in very old buildings, some dating from the late 1800s, and it's rumored that many of these businesses are connected through underground tunnels that date from the Prohibition era. It was early in the morning, so all of the shops in the buildings were closed, and there were very few people out and about. I liked my morning bike rides to school precisely for this reason. It was quiet, and it felt like the city belonged only to me for a little while. I had grown so used to the solitude when I noticed a man up ahead. I was immediately curious about him. He was standing behind one of the old buildings up ahead, and to my right, leaning against some rusted metal double doors, smoking a cigarette. It was the hat that piqued my interest first. It was a fedora. This was years before that particular hat became so ubiquitous, and you hardly saw it on anyone at the time. Then I noticed that his threads were super old school too. Collared shirt, suspenders, and pants that were not denim, straight out of the 1920s, and he was wearing it well. I remember thinking that it was funny for a guy who looked about the same age as me to be dressed like that, and that he must be kind of a quirky dude. When I was about 30 feet away, the guy turned towards me and saw me coming up the street. He made a face, almost as if I had startled him. Then he flicked the cigarette away, opened one of the rusted metal doors he had been leaning against, stepped inside, and shut it right behind him. When I rode past the metal doors, I had just watched him step through. I saw very clearly that those metal doors had been welded shut a long time ago, and that there was grass growing up through the crack in the sidewalk in front of the door that was completely undisturbed. When it hit me that I could possibly not have just seen a man go through those doors, I very nearly wrecked my bike. On the way home from school, burning with curiosity, I went back to the building where I had seen the man and went around to the front. The front of the building housed a shitty little dive bar, and after talking to a few of the employees, I was able to determine that yes, the doors had been welded shut and had not been used for a long time as anyone could remember. Furthermore, the entire back of that building had been walled off and was no longer being used for anything. Some have suggested that what I saw was a ghost. I reject this explanation because the man seemed to be as solid as I am. He interacted with solid objects and was even smoking a cigarette. I thought of going back and looking for the butts he had flicked, but thought that might be obsessive. There wasn't anything ghostly about him in the slightest. The theory that I favor currently is that I somehow interrupted a man from the past in the middle of his early morning smoke break. That would also explain his startled expression and hasty retreat after he saw me. The sight of a woman in jeans and sneakers riding a bright purple Schwinn must have struck him as odd.
I would have shared this story sooner, but I'd completely forgotten about this incident until a family member reminded me of it recently. It's probably the most comical paranormal encounter that I've experienced. This happened many years ago, when I was 14 or 15. Though I and my siblings grew up in Wyoming, my parents are both from Michigan, and we still have a buttload of family on both sides who live there. My dad's family has a sizable chunk of forested land that they've owned and lived on for well over 100 years. This land, which is still home to several of my aunts, uncles, and cousins, has always been referred to as the farm, even though we haven't been farmers for a long time. Every other summer, my family would take a trip to Michigan and visit the farm with my siblings and I, and we were always really excited because we had lots of cousins around our own age to play with, and the parents would just kind of let us run wild all summer. This particular summer, I'd met a boy through my cousins that I really liked. We hung out for a few weeks, made out awkwardly a few times, then he promptly broke up with me for another girl. I was absolutely devastated in that totally melodramatic way that only lovesick teenagers can be, and I spent most of the next day crying and moping around and generally annoying my cousins. Writing this now, I can't even tell you what the dude's name was or what he looked like, but I still recall the intensity of my emotions. My cousins decide that something must be done to cheer me up, so they decide that we should grab the tent and some sleeping bags and spend the night in the woods on my family's property. It was a little creepy up there at night, but that was a feature, not a bug, as we were the sort of kids that liked to scare ourselves for fun. Before we head out into the woods with our gear, my cousin Jill has the bright idea to pop a bag of microwave popcorn to bring along for a snack. The hike into the woods isn't a long one, so the popcorn is still pretty hot by the time we set up the tent and dump it from the bag into a big plastic bowl. The first hour or so is pretty uneventful. We're sitting in the tent, telling creepy stories, and painting each other's nails. It's like a weird mix of camping trip and slumber party. I should probably add that it's mostly my cousins that are doing these things, and I'm mostly sitting on the periphery, feeling sorry for myself because I'm still so upset about this boy. As soon as it's full dark, the noises start. It takes us a minute to figure out what it is, and when we do, we're a little alarmed. We had pitched our tent in a clearing next to a battered old fence post that was sticking out from the ground, and the noise we were hearing is a succession of tiny rocks or pebbles striking that fence post. Someone's out there in the woods, throwing rocks near our tent and trying to get our attention. This freaks us out a bit because we're 5 teenage girls on our own in a tent out in the middle of nowhere in the woods at night, and it dawns on us how vulnerable we are. My cousins call out, "Who's there?" and the barrage of pebbles stops for a moment, then resumes. After a few minutes, we decide that the culprit is probably our older boy cousins who must have followed us into the woods and were just trying to scare us. We all agree that, of course, this is the explanation, so if we ignore him, they'll get bored and go away. At about this time, I was so emotionally and physically exhausted that I somehow managed to crash out. My cousins stay up, and that, they later told me, is when things got really weird. The rocks stopped completely, and they started to hear heavy footsteps circling the tent. Whatever was out there was also making strange noises, grunts and groans and growls. One of my cousins finally works up the courage to unzip the tent flap a little and peer out with her flashlight in hand. She thinks she sees a dark and very tall shape moving amongst the trees surrounding the clearing. Whatever it is, it's huge, and she's no longer convinced that it's our cousins screwing with us after all. So my cousins, sweet girls that they are, decide to leave me sleeping in the tent while they make a run for it back out of the woods into my aunt's house to get help. They zip the tent flap up carefully behind them, like it's somehow supposed to protect my sleeping self from whatever boogeyman is out there. Then they hightail it the hell out of there. Thanks, bitches. I'm awaked about 20 minutes later by Jill shaking me while shouting in my face, "Tara! Oh, God! Tara, are you okay?" I'm groggy and annoyed, and can't imagine why she's freaking out. But even before I'm fully awake, a pungent odor assaults my nostrils. The entire tent reeks of some sort of huge animal. It's difficult to describe, but it almost reminded me of the tiger cage at the zoo. I ask my cousins what the horrible smell is. This upsets them even more. Then one of the other cousins starts screaming, "Oh my God! The popcorn! Look at the popcorn!" And I'm even more confused. It was a few minutes before they'd calmed down enough to tell me what happened. Apparently, when they returned to the tent, armed with one of my uncle's shotguns and a couple baseball bats, yes, swear, that family, they found out that the tent flap had been unzipped. They immediately jumped to the conclusion that I'd been abducted or murdered by a creeper in the woods. But no, there I am, still snoring away. But the tent reeks like an animal. Dirt's been tracked in, and it's all over our sleeping bags. And the popcorn, that big plastic bowl of buttery popcorn, is completely gone. Not even a single unpopped kernel is in the bowl or anywhere around it. We noped out of there and spent the rest of the night at my aunt's house, but we didn't get much sleep. The next morning, in the hopes of finding a rational explanation, we casually asked my aunt if the boy cousins were around last night, and if they went up into the woods at all. Aunt says nope. Boy cousins weren't even here. They'd all gone to some concert in a nearby town and spent the night with friends. They didn't arrive home until later that afternoon. I've always been fascinated with paranormal phenomena, so it really chaps my ass that probably the closest I ever came to literally touching something otherworldly, I was passed out cold. Some as yet unidentified creatures sat next to me in the tent eating popcorn, and I literally slept right through it. And all because I was upset over some douchebag boy. So I guess the moral of the story is, don't dwell too much on the past, because it just might cause you to miss out on some really interesting stuff that's going on in the present.